Welcome everyone to, what is it? I can't remember. It's the fourth of the Winter Talk series, and we've had quite an amazing bunch of speakers so far, and I think tonight is going to put another twist on adventures and things to inspire. So tonight we've got James Nicholson and John Tullis. They're probably quite different talks, but that's what adds to the interest. And I think if everyone's, so tonight, for any of you that want to make a sort of a contribution to a charity just for having had a free talk, it's the RNLI, the Royal National Lifeboat Institute, who I don't think we've ever donated to. So I think it's quite a nice nice thing to do that. So Declan, I hopefully will post a link and you'll see it on the latest of my many emails on the talks, or you can just go to the RNLI webpage yourself at some time. It's a bit hard for us to track donations that way, but you know, we'll make an estimate of what we think we might raise on the basis of how many people. So there you go. Declan's just put the thing up. If you can just Google it if you don't use that link. So looks like we're up to about 40 people. I think we'll if James, are you happy to kick off?
Yeah.
That we'll have James, we'll probably just have a few-minute break in the middle and go straight on to John Tullis. So I'd like to introduce everyone to James Nicholson.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity to come and have a talk this evening. So I'm a relatively new Carnethy member. I joined in August because I moved up to Edinburgh then. And I think the first thing I did with the club was the Fisherfield round as part of the Munros in a day. And other than that, I've been sort of lurking in the shadows a little bit. But I'm going to talk a little bit about the Three Peaks Yacht Race, which I was able to do last spring. You might have heard of this race, or you might have heard of the Scottish Island Peaks Race, which is a similar race, but that starts in Oban and finishes in Troon. The Three Peaks Yacht Race is a similar sort of format, but goes from mid-Wales all the way up to Fort William. So it's a slightly longer race, and the runs have very different characteristics. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. I'm hoping, you know, some of you may have done it before, but I'm hoping there's people out there who'll be inspired to join the sort of annual matchmaking of runners and sailors that takes place for this event to happen, because it's just fantastic. So my two loves really have always been the sea and mountains. So when I heard about this race, probably as a teenager, I was just enthralled by it and wanted to do it. And the opportunity never really came up. And I was just finishing university last spring. We were kind of coming out of all the COVID restrictions, and I saw a bit of an opportunity to do it. I didn't have a boat to do it on, but this is the boat that I managed to sort of find my way onto. And it took place in sort of mid-June, so the longest day. And I'll show you the route and talk about how it went really. So I'll tell you a bit about the route. I'll tell you about the crew that we had on board and the boats, and a bit about how the sailing bit works. I'll talk to you about the legs and what happened. And then I've got some sort of sailors tips for runners, and Andy kindly, who may be able to join us later, has put some runners tips for runners based on his experience. So I'm a runner and a sailor, but I did the sailing for this leg because we had two landlubber runners on board who did the running. So I can talk a bit about both, but I thought it might be interesting to hear a bit about the sailing because it's probably the side people are less familiar with. So the race starts in Barmouth, a sort of sleepy town in mid-Wales, and the first sailing leg goes to Carnarvon in North Wales, and then there's a run to the top of Snowdon. And these runs, you know, are slightly, the Three Peaks aren't necessarily by the sea, as you might have realised, so that they can be challenging runs. And then the second sailing leg goes from Carnarvon to Whitehaven. So they used to use Ravenglass in the Lake District, but now they use Whitehaven, where there's a tidal lock that I'll talk about in a bit. And then from there, there's a bike ride up through Ennerdale to Blacksail Youth Hostel, and a run over the top to Scarfell Pike at the top of Wasdale and back again. And then there's a sail from Whitehaven to the Big Leg all the way up to Fort William to Corpac. And that's where the runners jump off and run up Ben Nevis and back to finish the race. So you have a team of 5 and 2 people have to run each mountain leg. And you can mix and match, but what most teams do is have 3 sailors and 2 runners. And I was kind of picked as the straddle sailor who could run if one of them, you know, had a bit of an injury or something, but that didn't need to happen. So it's over 390 miles of sailing. I say over because you can't always sail in a straight line. There's 40 miles of cycling and actually 55 miles of running. So it's really a 3 modality rather than 2 modality race. It's pretty cool. So I was, you know, desperate to do this race, and I didn't know anyone who was doing it. So they have a bit of it's almost like an online dating forum on the Three Peaks website. So I put a little bit of a sell about myself on there in I think late April, and to try and find a place to do this race. And it's a really easy way to do it if you're interested. And this chap got back to me. He's called Charlie, and he lives in Anglesey. He's a retired doctor. And the things we found out about Charlie during the course of the race was that he had done 3 Everest expeditions as an expedition doctor. He was a former president of the British Mountaineering Council, and he had a stuffed cat on board that we thought was a real cat until we got to at least Scotland. So he was quite a character. Hadn't done much racing, but had done a lot of sailing. So he was good. He kind of roped me into it as the sort of co-skipper, because I had a bit more racing experience and quite a lot of sailing. And I kind of understood the running aspect a bit more as well. I roped in a really good friend who I'd lived with at university called James Allison. He had been an orienteer in a former life, but was now very much a sailor. And he won't mind me saying that he'd recently finished chemotherapy for a cancer that had been diagnosed while he was at uni. So he'd had the all clear from that, and he was basically trying to become a full-time sailor. So he was our sort of racing hotshot tactics guy on the boat. And then we had 2 runners. We had Andy, who may join us at some point. So Andy was an ex-Met police officer who'd kind of seen the light after retirement and only started running then. Andy's working away to do a 100-mile ultra at the moment. So he was kind of a later in life discovered fell runner, who was a pretty fast guy as well. And then we had Graham. So Graham was a London-based runner who'd done things like the Marathon des Sables and the UTMB. But he was used to running around flat London. So the Three Peaks was a bit of an interesting challenge as well. So we had a bit of a motley crew. None of us had really known each other before, other than the 2 Jameses. So it was kind of, from the beginning, quite exciting from that perspective. And so this was the boat that we were on. It was Charlie's boat. It was called Whiskey Galore, and the boat was a Nicholson 35, which is no relation to me, but it was a sort of they're a 35-foot ocean-going, pretty reliable boat, but very much not a racing boat. So you can see that a lot of the rope controls are all at the mast, and don't run back to the back of the boat. The winches aren't particularly powerful, so it was quite hard work to race the boat. And what may be a sort of a surprise to the runners is in a running race, it's the first across the line that wins. In a sailing race, it's a bit more complicated because you have faster boats and slower boats. So we have a handicap system, which is a number either side of 1, from which the sailing time is adjusted. So we were one of the slowest boats in the race. And we had a handicap of 1.2, and the fastest boat had a handicap of 0.8. So they could have sailed in 20 hours what we sailed in 30 hours, and it would have been a sort of tie. So that was something the runners were really confused about when we were right at the back, and they were saying, what on earth is going on? But we were kind of a slower boat who were out there for one of the longest times. So there was a lot of prep for the boat. Charlie dug out a big bag of sun cream, some of which had been on an Everest expedition in the 1970s. So we had to kind of do a lot of sorting through the boat and getting it race ready and light before we set off. And the race starts in Barmouth. So this was a photo I took running up the hill above Barmouth the day before the race. And all these moorings in a long line in the bay, and they put out specially for the race. And there were 15 or 20 boats when we did it. It's been bigger in the past, actually. Some of them had come from the Solent, from Scotland, from all over. There's been boats come from abroad. There was a Dutch boat that used to do it, but didn't because of COVID. So they did their own Three Peaks in Holland that year. But there's a really good atmosphere in Barmouth before the race starts. And we did some sort of prep, like scrubbing the bottom of the boat to try and go a bit faster, and got ourselves ready. So the race takes place over the midsummer weekend. And you start in Barmouth at midday on the Saturday. You know, there was a lot of, like, this was the only point in the race really where there was the whole fleet together racing and having to sort of dodge each other and use the rules of sailing to get out of each other's way. And there was quite a tight bunch fleet as we headed out across Barmouth Bay. Although we were one of the slower boats, we kind of played a wind shift quite well at the start, and we were out near the front for quite a lot of the way towards Abersoch. And then we came around Bardsley Head, Bardsley Island, where there's a really famous tidal race there, which we got stuck right in the middle of because of the time. And it was pretty sort of exciting rounding there. And then we spent the night working our way up Carnarvon Bay with sort of lulls in the wind as we went. It was about 6 a.m. on the Sunday morning, so we were all exhausted, and we woke the runners up to say, we're an hour from Carnarvon, get your kit up, get ready, get your porridge in. And we told them they'd be an hour away, and actually it took us a fair bit longer to get in, because just as we entered Carnarvon Bar, which is a sort of a very shallow bar across the entrance to the Menai Strait, and the tide turned against us and the wind died. So in a boat, if you're sailing into the wind, you have to zigzag your way. But with the tide against, we were kind of not making any progress over the bar. So one of the things you're allowed to do in this race, which is different to many sailing races, is you're allowed to row the boat or propel it by human means. So a lot of the boats are rigged up with oars and things like that. The boat we were on weighed about 10 tons. So we had some kayak paddles, and actually what we ended up doing to get across to the buoy where we were allowed to turn our engine on was getting a tender in the water and rowing and anchoring the yacht and then pulling it along. So it was a painful finish, and we got the runners ashore at about 9 a.m. There was one unlucky boat who'd been leading the fleet who went aground there on the sandbar. So it was really a game of snakes and ladders as we sailed past them. So this was the running route, and the first running route is quite a fast run. So here's Andy and Graham getting teed up to go ashore, and you jump ashore at the old Shell Pier in Carnarvon, which is quite barnacly, and there have been instances of runners in their haste to get ashore going in the water there. So it's a bit of a challenging landing, particularly if it's the middle of the night. And then there's a run up Snowdon. They were quite surprised because actually most of the run is on A roads really. So it's, although you're going up the Three Peaks, Andy particularly felt that it was a bit of a road run, which things like the Scottish Island Peaks race very much isn't. So it's quite a fast run. I think the winning time is about 4 or 5 hours. But we dropped them at 9:30, and they were back sort of just before 3 o'clock. And I think Graham was a little bit faster on the climb, but they kind of flew down the Llanberis path on the way back. So you do it in an anti-clockwise fashion. And then Sunday afternoon, they were back at the boat. So leg 2 we got onto now from the sailing. And in this race, at the start of leg 2, there's a big decision to make, which is from Carnarvon. You can either go the more direct route through what's called the Menai Strait, which is this really narrow, very strongly tidal stretch of water, or you can sail round Anglesey, which is the long way round. And if the tide's against you at the time the runners get back to the boat and you've missed that window, then you have to go the long way round, or wait until you can go the shorter way. So we ummed and ahed, and we decided that we would go up the Menai Strait. The challenge was that the wind was blowing against us, so we had to zigzag our way up the Menai Strait. It's called beating or tacking the boat, and we did 105 zigzags, as you can see on the track, to get out of the Menai Strait, and particularly through some of the narrow areas under what's called Britannia Bridge, and there's an area called the Swellies. We were sort of tacking every 3 seconds which is no mean operation. And the two runners basically got back on the boat, and we shoved them down below and told them to stay out of the way and gave them some food. And the boat was heeling right over as we did these manoeuvres, and you have to dodge the rocks and things. So they were a bit green by the time we got out to the top of Anglesey when we let them back up above deck. And I think one of the things they found really challenging was coming off a big, 5-6 hour hill run and then getting into a 15-foot box where they were being thrown around all over the place. I think they said that was the least enjoyable part of the race. But it was sort of early evening, and we got out into the Irish Sea, had a lovely sunset, had a really nice force 4 kind of wind. So we were making good progress, and we had a really big decision about which way we went across the Irish Sea to get to Whitehaven that evening. So we kind of took a pretty straight line, and Monday midday, we found ourselves off Walney Wind Farm, which is one of the biggest wind farms in the UK. And we were, completely out of the wind. It was a big dead hole that we landed up in, so we were just bobbing around basically. You can see this was the wind chart from the time, so it was really frustrating because out to the Isle of Man there was loads of wind, but where we were, we couldn't even fill the sails. And the faster boats ahead of us, although there was a handicap, they'd managed to get through when the wind was still really strong. So they shot off towards Whitehaven. And I've slightly exaggerated our track, but this was what it felt like as we were sitting bobbing around in the Irish Sea on day 3 of our race, thinking, will we ever get to Fort William? Meanwhile, the runners, we'd given them some Stugaron, which is seasickness tablets, but famously that makes you quite sleepy. So they slept through the whole thing, which they probably needed for what was coming. And by Monday evening, the wind had filled, the wind was shifting round, so we had to do about 3 different sail changes, and we were working our way up towards Whitehaven. Coming into Whitehaven was really challenging because Whitehaven has a tidal lock because the outer harbour is very shallow. So there's a 6-hour window where you effectively have to sit outside and wait to get in. And we knew it was going to be really tight. So 1:30 in the morning, we were told, was the latest time we could get there. And as we approached, it initially looked like we'd get in a few hours before that, but the wind died just before we got to St. Bees Head. So we had to row the yacht, and we radioed the lock keeper and said, what's the latest we can get in? We're 1.9 meters deep. And he said, I'll stay open till 1:40 in the morning, but any later than that, you'll go aground. And so at 1:30, we just snuck into the lock in time. We actually had to keep the sails up as we went in and drop them in there, which we wouldn't normally do just because it was so tight. So we felt really kind of pleased that we'd saved that 6-hour wait. And the runners went off on, I think, what's the most exciting leg, which is the Scafell Pike leg. So for anyone who doesn't know the race, this is the leg that has both a bike and a run leg. So you cycle, what's the first bit is the coast-to-coast route on a dedicated cycle path from Whitehaven, and then you come up into Ennerdale Valley and you cycle kind of forest gravel tracks all the way up to Blacksail Youth Hostel, which is this remote youth hostel in the Lake District. I'll talk about bike choice in a minute because that really, a few teams struggle with that. And the guys came over the top of Blacksail Pass at sunrise and then dropped back down into Osdale and climbed up to Scafell Pike. And they got there sort of about 7 or 8 in the morning. I'd actually recce'd this route a few weeks before because it was the Ennerdale Horseshoe Fell Race. And I think if you were going to recce a route of a leg of the race, this would probably be the one to do because it's the most technical mountain run, really. And then it's a downhill cycle all the way back. So they generally say use a mountain bike for this race. Most people use a gravel bike or a cyclocross bike, which seems to work quite well. There was one team with 2 very fast Royal Marines who had been leading the race, but they had road bikes, they had triathlon bikes, and one of them got 6 punctures coming out of Ennerdale, which probably cost them the race. So what you do need if you do the race is ideally someone to kind of bring the bikes to Whitehaven, which is one of the logistical challenges. We managed to leave Whitehaven on the Tuesday afternoon, so this is day 4 of the race, and we had kind of perfect champagne sailing, so blue skies, strong winds, and it was pretty cold, and we headed across towards the Mull of Galloway, and we had to dodge the tide as we came round Burrow Head to the Mull of Galloway, and the runners were feeling pretty good. We've got a big supply of Greggs in Whitehaven, and everyone was quite happy, and we only had one leg left to sail. And we had a pretty horrible night as we came around the Mull of Galloway, and we floated up into the bottom of the Clyde, and the wind just died. So here's Graham, one of the runners, on Wednesday morning, and we were nowhere near as far forward as we thought we would be, and we thought if the wind wasn't forecast to be there really for the rest of the week, so we were a bit worried we wouldn't make the cutoff on the Friday. So we bobbed, and then out of nowhere the wind picked up, and on Wednesday evening we went round the Mull of Kintyre, which is a kind of famously technical bit of sailing, and we got hit by some really strong winds and stormy weather as we went round there. I'll show you our track. So I think what makes this race really exciting from a sailing perspective is sections like this. So round the Mull of Kintyre, you get the tide from the Irish Sea meeting the tide from the Atlantic, and there's a hell of a lot of water that's got to get through a small space between Kintyre and Ireland in a small time, and so the tide races around the Mull of Kintyre, but you actually get a little back eddy for about 50-60 meters off the cliffs. And because of the time we got there, which we didn't have any choice over, we had to sail in this back eddy. And we were also sailing into the wind, so we had to do that zigzagging again. We zigzagged for most of the race, and you can see our track here. We were having to sail really close to the cliffs in thick fog, and Andy, the runner who'd done a bit of sailing in the past, was really enjoying it, and Graham was down below having some sleep, and it was sort of Wednesday evening, getting dark in the fog, tacking off the lighthouse. So that was a really exciting bit of sailing that I'll remember for a long time. And then we had a really good night on the Wednesday. The wind came behind us, so we were able to put our big spinnaker up, and we kept that up for 13 hours that day as we flew up through the Sound of Gia, the Sound of Jura, and then up into places like the Sound of Lyng, where the Corryvreckan whirlpool is. This was a photo I took when we were navigating in thick fog through the Sound of Lyng. By this stage, Andy, the runner, had kind of learned the ropes of how to sail the boat, so he was doing a lot of the work up top, really. And we only had a GPS down below, so I was having to sort of call the jibes, the turns from downstairs in the boat. And actually, when I took this photo, I got a ping on my phone, and it was an email to say I'd graduated from medical school. So I famously graduated medical school in the Sound of Lyng in the fog, going at 8 knots. So that was quite exciting. And we were making really good progress up through past Oban. And I said to the team, I said, I think it's Thursday, and we're going to get to Fort William tonight, and we'll finish on the Thursday. And I was wrong. So we got to this place. I don't know if anyone recognises this, but this is the Corran Narrows, which is a pinch point at the bottom of Loch Linney, down from Fort William. And Loch Linney is a huge loch that's 100 metres deep in places, and there's a huge body of water in Loch Linney and Loch Eel that has to come out to sea and back in every day on the turning of the tide. And the Corran Narrows are probably a couple of 100 metres wide, maybe a bit more, and down to just 20 or 15 metres deep. So the tide rushes really fast over the Narrows. And we were sailing towards the Narrows. There was a boat about half a mile ahead who we'd been catching up with all day, and they snuck through. And at this point, the wind just died off, and the tide started to turn. So we decided we needed to get through, and we needed to row the boat. So we got the oars out, and we were making really slow progress as the tide was building against us. And you do some things in this race that you wouldn't do in real life. So there was one boat in the race that used all 200 meters of rope they had on board to anchor in the Irish Sea, and the anchor wouldn't come up, and they had to cut away the rope. So there are all sorts of stories, but our story was that we tried to take a rope ashore. So I was standing on deck in my boxer shorts, the other guys were with kayak paddles trying to row, and I was ready to swim ashore, not that far off the beach. And there was some very bemused dog walkers wondering what on earth we were doing. But at this point, a big gust of wind came down the loch. And although there was now wind to sail through, the tide was running really strong, and we couldn't zigzag our way through the gap. So we had to wait 6 hours before we could make the last leg up to Fort William. So that was a real low point of the race, and everyone was kind of really upset and frustrated because we thought we were going to get there that night. So this was that narrow pinch point we got to, and what we did is we bailed off and we dodged this big sandbar and came into Ballahoolish Bay at the bottom of Glencoe. And at this point, we heard over the radio Oban Lifeboat calling our call sign, which was Whiskey Galore, the name of the boat. And it transpired that the dog walkers at Corran had seen a bunch of blokes trying to paddle a 10-ton yacht through the Narrows with one guy standing on deck in his boxer shorts, and thought, what on earth is going on? And so Oban Lifeboat had been scrambled to a yacht in distress. And I've done years and years of sailing and lots of instructing, and this is the only time I've had a run-in with the RNLI. But they radioed us, we confirmed that we were okay, and they headed back to Oban. But it was a bit embarrassing, but also it was really nice to know that that help was there if we needed it, really. And as soon as they realised what we were doing, they kind of realised why we've been making a fool of ourselves at Corran. So the final stages of the race, but we had to anchor just down from Ballahoolish Bridge in this little bay on the left here, and we set off there from 1 a.m. And we sailed back up through the Narrows without any problems this time, and we zigzagged our way up into Corpac, just off Fort William. And we got there Friday morning, and the cut-off time was Friday evening to finish the race. So the runners went off up the biggest run elevation-wise, but nowhere near as challenging as the Ennerdale one. It was a kind of road run into Glen Nevis, and then they worked their way up the tourist path along the route of the Ben Nevis Fell Race, and then back down again. So by this point, the sailors were asleep on board, having had a whiskey. But the runners had a pretty wild time on the top. There was still some ice on the paths because this was June on the top of the Ben. And so they had a pretty wild run. But they said, you know, this was really a climb rather than a run because it was just such a steep route. But they got back to us at 11:20. It's a slightly blurry picture of us all on the finish line in Corpac. And actually, we were the last boat to finish in the time limit. So we won the last in trophy. And we came sort of mid-fleet on the handicap, and all the other boats behind us were out the race really, but eventually got up there. So that was quite nice, despite being the slowest boat, that we were the only one at the back who finished in time. So I know I'm running tight on time, and it's a long tale to tell in 25 minutes. So bear with me as I just wrap up. I just thought, you know, hopefully there's some people out there who have kind of enjoyed the concept of the race and the story. And I'll give you just some tips from my perspective. So I think realizing that some boats go faster than others, and the handicap aspect is important, but the handicaps don't always win, and it's a big game of snakes and ladders, this race, which makes it kind of fun and means it can change at any point. As a runner, you'll spend a lot of time on the boat kind of not able to move around, and that can be quite uncomfortable between runs, so it's a real challenging experience. Seasickness tablets. Seasickness was a big problem in the Irish Sea for the runners, partly because they were down below and not doing so much. But seasickness tablets are really good at making you sleep, so they used that to their advantage. And actually, both the runners, so Graham had never been on a boat at all, not even a ferry before this experience, and we had him doing things by the end of the race, so they really enjoyed learning how to sail a bit as well. And actually, having done a lot of running and a lot of sailing, I was surprised how exhausting the sailing was, because there were two of us awake, you know, all the time for 4 or 5 days, and it was just cognitively exhausting as well as physically quite hard work. And then Andy, who hasn't been able to join us, I can click, has just done some tips, which he said nutrition was really challenging because you were told we're going to be ashore in an hour, and then the wind would die, and they'd be sitting there for 3 hours waiting to go. So that was really challenging. A a lot of the running was on roads, which compared to things like the Scottish Island Peaks Race, it's not the case. Don't choose a road bike you choose a gravel or a cross bike for the Ennerdale section, and think about how you're going to jump back onto the boat, not be able to sort of cool down or stretch much, and how you're going to recover and fuel up for the next run. So sorry that I've run over by a few minutes. That's my story on the Three Peaks Yacht Race 2021. The race is back this year. The online dating board on the notice board is there for any runners looking for a boat, and I would just highly recommend it as one of the best races I've done and probably ever will do. It's fantastic.
Wow, James, that is fascinating. That's a heck of a story. I'll open up for questions, and just while people are thinking, they can unmute their mics to ask a question. But I guess, one obvious question to me, you did mention it a bit, but how did you have a duty chef? How did you all cook for each other, or was it the person who's down below you're cooking?
Yeah, so that was quite a big job. I was the vegetarian on board, so I kind of volunteered myself to try and convert the carnivores on board to some veggie food. So that was, the sailors did most of that. Some on the longer legs, the runners did some cooking on board as well. And we had for the sailing, we had a 4-hour watch system. So you were effectively up for 4 hours, off for 2, up for 4 hours, off for 2. So that was just exhausting, really.
Thank you. I saw a question come in there on the chat. I think it was from Claire. So Claire, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you were obviously a sailor in the race, but you said you might have wanted to run. Are you glad you stuck with that sailing decision, or did you also think you kind of wish you were doing the running?
I'd love to go back and run it. I think I underestimated how challenging the sailing was. I'm probably a better sailor than a runner, just about. But the sailing was, I think, for this race, probably more interesting than the running. I think I'm going to run the Scottish Island Peaks race this spring, so I think that's probably a more interesting race as a runner. The two people have once done it as a pair and ran and sailed every leg, and that would be something that would be amazing to do one day, but I think that would be a pretty crazy undertaking, really.
Thanks. I'll see you in Oban for the Scottish Islands Peaks race. I'm taking some students for a youth team, so.
Brilliant. And I think Gordon said of their marshals and kit checks. So yeah, there's like a 5-minute timeout at the start and finish of every leg. And there's quite a comprehensive kit list that the runners have to carry.
I saw a question came in. I think it was Stephanie, but I can't. Steph, do you want to ask a question there?
Sure. It's just the same as what I've written there. Like, did you hear whether it's quite oversubscribed? Like, are there many runners who want to find a team and boat who can't?
Good question. I think the runners who want to do this race are always really nervous about finding a boat, and the boats that want to do this race are always really nervous about finding runners. And I guess there's some really competitive sailing teams who want to have competitive runners, and there's also some sort of less competitive sailing teams who want to sort of focus on enjoying the adventure. So I think there's a bit of matchmaking that has to take place. I think if you put yourself out there early, then it's far easier. I actually spoke to 2 or 3 different boats before I settled on the boat that I did the race with, and I think it was, the right choice. I'd love to go back and do it on a more of a racing boat, but actually I don't think we'd have had anywhere near as much as we wouldn't have had the adventure in the same way. But I think it's quite a challenging run, so I think there are definitely people who want to do it who end up not doing it, but I think the pairing is perhaps the challenging bit from both directions, of finding people that you're willing to spend 5 days feeling seasick off the west coast with.
Cool, thanks.
Well, if anyone has any more questions, I'll take one more, and then I think we'll have a 2-minute break if you want to just. So, is there any more questions? And then we'll have a 2-minute break and go on to the next speaker.
I can come in with one last question. Fantastic talk, James. That was really cool. I'd be very keen to sign up for that perhaps next year. How many hours of sleep would you say you got throughout the 4 or 5 days?
I don't know. I think I probably got enough sleep, but it was broken. You know, it was 3 hours here, 3 hours there, being woken up to do sail changes. So I probably got about 4 or 5 hours a night. But I certainly found I was kind of navigating and making a lot of the decisions about the tides and which routes we took. And I found those decisions towards the end of the race, which was certainly where the sailing got more challenging, were just really difficult, because cognitively the decision fatigue was so significant, and I felt the sleep deprivation certainly when I was trying to, make decisions about the sailing. And when we got stuck at Corpac, actually, there was a very big decision we had to make in a very short period of time about whether we went over a sandbar or round. And I remember having to make that decision in the moment, and really struggling, and we made the right decision. But lots of boats do go aground, and things happen on the race just because it's so challenging from the sleep perspective, probably.
Yeah, amazing. Thanks for that.
Well, there is, the details are there if anyone wants to sign up. I'm kind of tempted, but not for the road running. I think the other one might be better for me. So let's just have a quick break for 2 minutes, and then we can get John loaded up, and then we'll introduce him. So if anyone wants to grab a drink, whiz off. So I'd like to introduce John Tullis. I kind of heard of this talk at some data festival or festival, I can't really remember, but I thought, well, that sounds really interesting. So I'm going to say no more, but over to John Tullis, who will introduce himself. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Mark, and good evening, everyone. Before I launch into my presentation, I actually want to start by asking you all a question. But before I do that, I need you to imagine something. I want you to imagine you're new to Munro bagging, okay? You've maybe done 1 or 2 hills, at most a handful, and yet you're absolutely 100% going to do them all. You've got the bug, you've been bitten. You resolve to climb them all, and this is going to become your life's focus for, say, the next few years. Nothing will stand in the way of you summiting all 282 Munros, which, as a reminder, are Scotland's mountains over 3,000 feet. Let's imagine you're fit and healthy. You've got lots of free time, lots of weekends, and you've got access to a car. That's going to be quite important. My question is this: where should you live to indulge your new passion for Munro bagging? And if you could live anywhere in Scotland, where would you move to? In other words, where is the best place for Munro bagging? And that's the question we're going to answer. So to start with, we've got a blank map of Scotland here. We're going to be looking at loads of maps tonight. And on top of this map, I'm going to draw our Munros. So there are 282 of these at the moment. That number has changed over the years. When Munro created the list, he actually had 283, although they were slightly different. And over the years, there have been revisions. Different mountains have been resurveyed, different heights have been found. People have tinkered with them. People still debate what should be a Munro, what shouldn't. It's not quite clear. But let's work on the basis that these are the ones you need to get in the bag, as it were. You might like to think about where the roads are, because you're going to have to get around to do this challenge. These days, most of us drive to and from start points. You might think about public transport. These are railways. Some people do it by train and bike. Some people do it by bus. Munro and his contemporaries were massive rail users. At the start of the 1900s, you could get to many mountains much more easily by train than you can today. There were lines up to places like Fort Augustus, Ballachulish, Loch Tay, which don't exist anymore. You might also be interested in the topography. Now, this map just shows land height and Munros and nothing else. And I absolutely love maps like this. And if we just zoom in on the area with all the Munros, depending on your screen, so I'm looking at this on a huge screen, at my office desk. You might be on an iPad or a laptop, but hopefully you can see quite a conspicuous collection of Munros around the Cairngorms and an awful lot of high ground there. We can almost see, you can see the A9, you can see D-side. So loads of Munros up for bags there. Not a lot around the other high ground of the Monalier, but then the west coast of Scotland, there's all sorts of interesting east-west ridges and valleys snaking all the way up to the north. So maps like this, I think, can really put the mountains in a slightly better topographic context. You may then want to overlay the roads and the topography and the mountains. And I think this is when the challenge starts to come alive, because you can see how you're going to get there. And I think this kind of map, it almost reduces the enormity of the challenge. It looks a bit more achievable. And if you've done a lot of Munros, and imagine that you haven't, but say you have, you can probably start to pick them off even just by eye. I'm very aware and impressed that Carnethy did them all in a day last year. And the record the year before that for a single solo mission was Donny Campbell, who did it in 32 days. Most hill walkers take several years, and many don't finish at all. Munro, for example, didn't finish his round before he died, unfortunately. He was close, but he was also collecting the tops, which are the subsidiary summits, as well as the Munros themselves. But for the purposes of tonight, we're not talking about superhuman endurance. We're just talking about kind of good, honest plodding up and down at the weekend. We want to make it easy. We want to save time. We want to minimize driving and therefore fuel and mileage. So just have a look at this map and think where you might want to be. Where do you want to locate your new home? And budget is no option. The reason I'm posing this question, there are two reasons. One, in reading Munro books about the history, about guidebooks, invariably you read about ministers and teachers who had to move around, say people in slightly peripatetic professions that got posted in different places. And as a result of those movements in the Highlands, they suddenly had loads of Munros on their doorstep, almost literally. That got me thinking, if you can move around and suddenly find hills on your doorstep, there's got to be somewhere that's the optimum location. I'm a geographer by trade, and I love maps and location planning and analytics. I work at the university as a data analyst. So I was kind of interested in answering this question, where would be best? The question also allows me to kind of take you on a journey where we're looking not just at maps, but some of the people, some of the trivia, some of the history. So the question itself is a means to an end, but let's see where we go. There are four quite special Munros I'd like to introduce you to. So we've got Ben Hope in the north, Mount Keene in the east, Ban Lomond in the south, and Sgurr Banachdig in the west. And these four are known as the cardinal Munros, and they have been done in a day. Unfortunately, it was by another running club with this slightly garish yellow t-shirts. These are the Westies, who got written up by Fiona Outdoors, who has a fantastic blog. Unfortunately, though, they didn't make it into the BBC like you lot. Again, like massive congratulations for that challenge. But the Cardinal Munros are a nice little adventure if anyone is looking to do the four in a day. I'd also like to give a little introduction to Ben More on Mull, which is by far the most isolated. You really have to have a reason to go there. And that's why many people use it as their sometimes first, but often last Munro. So that's the geographic picture. If we scoot them over to one side now, I want to make room for the real star of the show. This is Hugh Thomas Munro. He was born in 1856, died in 1919 at the age of 63. There's so much we could say about him, but there are loads of books already. There's loads of guidebooks. I don't want to spend too much time on information that kind of already exists and it's already widely available. But in short, Munro was tasked at the end of 1890 by the newly formed Scottish Mountaineering Club. They asked him to compile a list of Scottish mountains over 3,000 feet. And he completed that in about 8 months of very intense effort. It's fairly clear they needed someone meticulous, rigorous, a real stickler for detail, obsessive almost. And in Munro, they absolutely got those things. There were some previous lists. It wasn't like these mountains were unknown. Many people knew of them. Some had compiled lists, but the SMC, the Scottish Mountaineering Club, they wanted a definitive record, and therefore they tasked Munro with that. Now, looking at this picture and based on some of the things he's written in the journal, it seems to me like Munro was someone who really cared. He cared deeply about the task in hand, creating his tables, and look at the legacy that they've created, the very fact that we're talking about them tonight. He cared about his mountaineering club, the presidency of which he took enormous pride in. And it's clear from his writing how much he loved Scotland. He loved wild places and hill panoramas and just the joy of being in the hills, which is quite unusual for a Victorian gentleman to admit that. So the tables that he created first appeared in 1891 in the Journal of the SMC, the Scottish Mountaineering Club. And on line 4, he alludes to almost the impossibility of deciding what constitutes a distinct mountain. And it makes things quite murky. It's not totally clear what the rules are. There isn't a formula for what's a Munro and what's not. And I've already mentioned that that list has been refined over the years. Also, why 3,000 feet? What's so special about that? Even the foot itself is a slightly arbitrary measure based, if you look back in history, based on not just the size of soldiers' feet, but like the 12 bits of barley laid end to end. It's a little bit arbitrary. What if it was 3,000 feet or 3,500 or 2,500? What if we'd already gone metric by the time Munro was doing this? So 3,000 feet in meters is 914.4, which isn't quite as catchy. It's not as round a number. And if the cutoff was, say, 1,000 meters, we would have far fewer Munros. So in some ways, it's quite a happy coincidence that 3,000 feet gives just the right level of challenge. It's by no means easy, but it's certainly doable, especially with a house in the right place. So keep thinking about that. Another happy coincidence, or perhaps a very deliberate outcome, is that the task of identifying these hills was left to Hugh Munro. And when you look at this table, and this is just one example from that original journal, it's really obvious how methodical, how ordered he was. If he was alive today, I'm quite sure he would be a spreadsheet man, of which I'm one myself. And he notates all sorts of information to help not just people categorize the mountain, but also how to get there. Where's the best place to climb it from? It's almost a very early and primitive walk highlands. He wanted to share, not just to categorize. I understand that your club is extremely fond of spreadsheets, and I'd like to think that Munro would be somewhat intrigued, if not bemused, to see what we're up to tonight. And I dare say possibly a little bit horrified too at just the sheer number of people trampling up and down hills and car parks, all essentially in his name. So I think it's quite interesting to dig in a bit more detail about Munro the man. So here he is pictured in 1891 at one of the club meets. This is from Dalwhinnie. He's very fond of his Balmoral bonnet, and he's got quite a long alpenstock, which is kind of like an early big ice axe, which would have been brought back from climbing in the Alps, which many of these early members used to do in their summers. In this image, we can see Munro and his contemporaries after the first winter ascent of the northern pinnacles of Liagas in 1890. And this time we see they've got hobnail boots and hemp ropes. So all sorts of advancements in mountaineering equipment. I think it's also worth drawing attention to one really important piece of Munro's kit, and that's his aneroid barometer, sometimes just referred to as an aneroid. So Munro was fastidious about taking height measurements on all the places he climbed, but particularly during that intense 8-month burst of energy where he was completing the tables. It was all about measuring and recording and ordering, very much channeling the ethos of the Victorian scientist. Now, you might think, why didn't he just look at the map? If it was 3,000 feet and above, why would he need to take his own measurements? Well, I can show you why, because these are the maps that Munro had available to him. So this is the 1 inch to the mile OS map. And these were relatively new at the time, so quite kind of hot items to have if you were Munro, if you were interested in heights. We're going to zoom in on this little box here, which is a very well-known hill called Schiehallion. And you'll notice that the contours are at quite a course, 250 feet. There are some spot heights on the summits themselves, but this is a fairly coarse map, and in some places is more accurate than others. He also had access to the 6-inch maps, which are much more detailed, but they don't have contour lines. This example is from the Cairngorms, just to the east of Loch Arn. And again, if we zoom in, we can see some spot heights, but not a lot else. So this is what Munro had to pore through to figure out not only where the possible candidate Munros were, but also to get himself up there with his barometer and his thermometer and to take all sorts of measurements to try and verify for himself. So he really was contributing and perhaps endorsing or conflicting with some of the Ordnance Survey findings, which was certainly not to be relied on. And I think that's quite a distinction to today, where most of us treat the OS as fairly sacrosanct. Munro actually wasn't the first. There's been quite a lot of recent research about Professor Matthew Heddle, who preceded Munro by some decades with his own list, but unfortunately, no one's been able to find it yet. He's written about his list of mountains in Scotland, and he climbed many of them, but we haven't found the original list. But it is, again, worth reminding people that many folk were up the Munros before they were even Munros. Okay, so turning to the present day then, we've looked at old maps and we have some slightly more contemporary efforts to figure out how high these hills are, because to some people it really matters. Is it a Munro or not? And there are quite a few professional and amateur surveyors who have bought extremely expensive GPS equipment to go and figure it out, much to the dismay of some Munro baggers who climbed a hill which has since been demoted, and others which might have been promoted from Corbetts to Munros. Some of these people have received some slightly unwanted attention, and I have a book here in which they feature. It's called The Dull Men of Great Britain, and it talks about the 3 hill walkers who spent £10,000 on professional surveyor grade GPS equipment that measures height accuracy to within 5 centimeters. It's a good read if anyone wants to learn about people and their passions. I don't feature in it yet. So the point here, I guess, is that Munro and his folk, they embraced kit and technology, whatever they could get their hands on. I dare say some of you are looking forward to a new Garmin watch or perhaps some kind of fancy Gore-Tex fabric. And I'm sure these guys would have been exactly the same if they're alive today. Even map and compass were new at one point. It's really easy for us to get nostalgic about the days before GPS, but I would suggest that all kind of developments in hillcraft and mountaineering, they've gone hand in hand with technological advances, particularly recently with all the data that we've got, electronic devices, the means to share routes and photos in real time, Strava heat maps, what 3 words and all the like. So I do see it as a kind of continuing landscape of technological development, which these early Munroists absolutely embraced. Munro was also a big talker. He enjoyed music and dancing and entertaining, and here are some of his mountaineering friends on board an Easter yacht meet. So they hired a great big yacht, and the idea was to take it to Skye and to climb lots of hills. Unfortunately, the weather was really dreadful, and they weren't able to anchor in Loch Scavaig because of the southwesterly. So they found themselves on the west coast of Scotland, and they ended up visiting Rum and Knoydart and a few other places. And I figured that because this was something of a show and tell, I wanted to show you some of my own pictures from Rum, because this is very much the view that Munro would have seen. This is Blavan, as seen from south of Skye, and I was on a ferry actually to Rum, where Munro landed himself some years later. And I suppose the point I want to make here is that neither of these hills on Rum are Munros. Askeval on the left there is a Corbett, so it's over 2,500 feet with a drop of at least 500 feet. But if you're starting from sea level, you've got quite a lot of ascent there. Whereas say you're going up the ski centre at Cairngorm, you're starting about 630-ish meters above sea level. So is that kind of cheating? What if you cycle up a Munro or take an e-bike? What about the chairlift at Glen Shee? I guess the point is that some people get so hung up on the Munro idea that they forget that there are other rewarding, if not more demanding, hills out there. And again, I'm super impressed that you guys are embarking upon the Corbetts this year, and good luck with that. So my own adventure on Rum, again, I suppose it's ironic in a way that there are no Munros here, and yet the scenery and the experience was no less magnificent. It was a mid-October day. I left at very short notice and saw a weather window and was able to pounce. So we're looking west here over to Muck and Sanday and the Outer Hebrides behind. And then turning back inland, these are the Rum Coolin, which I was determined to camp on, but from this perspective, slightly unsure of how I might get there, because they really did look impenetrable. And I know it's often the way that once you get close to a peak, it looks less steep and you can see ways in. But from a distance, I was a little bit afraid. But I persevered. I saw the famous mausoleum with lots of Highland cows. And Rum's really an extraordinary place. And I hope whoever's running it for your Corbetts Day has good weather, because it makes all the difference. And I did find myself the next morning way up high on the ridge, determined to get a sunset picture. And ironically, the sun rose literally above our #1 Munro, at least by height, Ben Nevis. So I guess you can't get too far away from them. But really, really special memories from a trip to an island that has no Munros. And I suppose to look back on that from Arisaig, it's a real reminder that some of the best experiences in Scotland, they're not all about Munros. And I think Munro himself would be a little bit horrified at the number of people that are so blindly focused on pursuing his peaks, sometimes to the detriment of other areas. So some nice snaps from that trip. And that's, I thought I'd just, since I had a captive audience, show you some of those, and basically to show you how much I love wild Scotland. So anyway, let's turn back to the tables and the maps. And I wanted to show you where Munro lived. So this is his country pad called Lindertis. Munro was actually, he stood as a Tory candidate. He was unsuccessful, but I saw this rather amusing anecdote. Staunch Tories, so Hugh Munro, would probably have been quite disconcerted to learn that the first MP to complete his Munros should belong to the Labour Party. That was Chris Smith. But then, as Chris remarks, and 100 others echo, there is at least one Tory to whom we shall forever be grateful. So Lindertis is based down here in the bottom right of this map in Kirriemuir in the Angus Glens. And it got me thinking, if that's where he was starting, was that a good place to embark upon the Munros? We can draw it on this map here. So the red star is Munro's old pad. And for example, I can draw a radius on the map and we can look at how many Munros fall within that. In this case, in a 25-mile radius, we've got 21 Munros. Not bad. We can take another arbitrary distance, like say 100 miles. And in this instance, we get 232 Munros. So this is a way to start to compare the goodness, if you like, of different places. Now, because I like maps and data, it's quite easy to make this into an animation, which is a slightly more compelling way of showing changes over time. So we can increase that radius, and as it kind of includes the Munros, we can color them in red. We can also then create a couple of counters. So this time we've got radius and the Munro count, and you can see as the radius increases, that count grows and grows and grows until we get up to the magic 282. So you can see how this is developing. If we can do that, then presumably we can draw a graph. So now we're getting a little bit more analytical. We're running lots of iterations, and each time we're seeing that line. And this is starting to allow us to think a bit more critically. So we can see here that nothing really happens until about 14 miles. And then you get into the Southern Cairngorms, and there's quite a steep lift until about the Great Glen. And then you really need to keep traveling further to get more Munros. So it's not a bad place, but it's probably not where I would choose my dream location. We could compare it to somewhere else. And the obvious example that I thought of was Fort William. Let me just move on to the next slide. So Fort William here under this blue star, and we can run the same idea, but this time look at the graph, look at the numbers, look how they shoot up. So this is how I'd encourage you to start thinking about your dream home in terms of the bang for your buck. Clearly, there are so many more hills and Munros very close to Fort William. You've got them on your doorstep. That could be a good place. And if you want to compare the two, we can have Lindurtis in the red and Fort William in the blue. And instantly you can see steeper lines and more instant payback for living there. And again, this is a good way of kind of thinking analytically about where might be better. Now, if I were a sales agent for, say, Lindurtis, trying to encourage you to base yourself there, I might say, oh, well, there's 150 Munros within 75 miles. So just anytime someone gives you a statistic or a figure kind of out of context, it's always worth questioning, well, what does that mean in comparison? Because Fort William clearly is much better. But I think, yeah, I'm always suspicious of people that quote numbers and figures kind of like, show me the graph. And in this case, we can do that. Enough graphs for the time being. I wanted to look now at a man and a woman on a bicycle. So this is the Reverend A.E. Robertson, and he was actually the first person to complete all the Munros in 1901. He's actually on a tandem, and he was one of the first mountain bikers in Scotland, because he would go on all sorts of enterprising Munro bagging trips on his trusty bike. He even suggested that you could leave it in the heather and it would be there on your return, which most people these days, if you're, say, cycling up to Derry Lodge or something, I think most of us would lock it up. And I have heard some stories about bikes that have gone walkies. But the Reverend A. Robertson certainly made the most of his, and that was over 120 years ago. It's reputed that on finishing his last Munro, Mial Jarrick above Glencoe, he kissed the cairn and then his wife in that order. A little bit controversial. He was a very well-to-do minister, and he had the time and the financial means to really throw himself into this passion. He was particularly renowned for his multi-day expeditions, as indeed was Munro, by which I mean sometimes weeks-long trips where they would go via trains and boats, sometimes horse and cart, sometimes bicycle, mostly on foot, staying in different places with shepherds, stalkers and keepers. Many of their properties are now bothies, but back in Munro's days, the remote Highland glens were much more populated. And it seems that the hospitality of the locals was very forthcoming. And it's difficult to imagine. I mean, I've been on some camping trips and stayed in bothies, but the idea of just setting out with very little equipment and bagging a whole bunch of peaks and just knocking on people's doors and staying there is almost quite extraordinary and quite romantic in a way too. This is a picture, a map of one of Robertson's walks, and it's notated by month. So you can see that in May, he was down in Knoydart. He nipped over to the Cairngorms in July. On June, he was in Skye, and this is just one trip. And he was very, very particular about visiting new peaks that he hadn't been to before. So he wasn't just interested in bagging for the sake of bagging. He was really going to be the first. And it's just quite extraordinary, the lengths that they covered. These chaps were really, really tough. It's also intriguing that Munro went out in winter quite a lot to avoid disturbing any stalking. And he also went out at night because he believed very firmly in the rights of landowners not to have walkers on their land. Perhaps it was part of his conservative ethos. So he didn't want to get in people's ways, which again is quite, doesn't quite sit right with our slightly more enlightened, shall I say, access to land these days. So it's really interesting to compare how they bag things to how we might do it. And if we come back to our map with the roads, I think it is worth pointing out how although we can go on long adventures, and some people do plan, say, coast to coast, some people take their bikes, some people even go pack rafting these days. I think most of us especially if we live somewhere reasonably located, do the majority of Munros as single-day expeditions. Now, we're not going to consider, say, camper vans, which would be quite a practical way of doing it, because that's just going to make my analysis much, much harder. But equally, using straight line distances, using that radius as the crow flies, is much too simplistic, because it's not how people travel. People tend to travel in cars, and they tend to go to car parks. So I wonder if you can work out what's going on in this next slide.
Trailer for sale or rent, rooms to let 50 cents. No phone, no pool, no pets. I ain't got no cigarettes, oh, but 2 hours of pushing broom buys a 8x12 4-bedroom. I'm a man of means, by no means king of the road. Third boxcar, midnight train, destination Bangor, Maine. Oh, worn out suit and shoes. I don't pay no union dues. I smoke old stogies I have found. Short, but not too big around. I'm a man of means, by no means king of the road.
Okay, so what we've got here, instead of just flying as a crow to the Munro summits, what I did is made loads of queries, which it turns out is illegal to Google Maps, and saved the road data and kind of mashed it all together and played it back as a movie. So this shows the actual routes and the actual times it would take to reach each car park. And then when that car park, which is a grey circle, when that's reached the Munro, when the summits are mapped here, the triangles, they kind of light up. And one of my favourite bits is watching it cross over to Mull on the ferry, and you might have seen that up in Skye down in Glenbrittle was the furthest away, so about 5.5 hours from Edinburgh. So clearly we can say that Edinburgh, well, most of us probably live there. It's not bad as a base for Munro bagging, but it's certainly not the best. And the next idea I had was to compare Edinburgh with Glasgow. So let's have a look at this. Okay, so in this case, we started in Glasgow and Edinburgh exactly the same time. And if Glasgow got there first to the car park, it goes green. If Edinburgh got there first, it goes red. And you can see that Glasgow, well, the map is very green. Edinburgh has a slight advantage for much of the Cairngorms, nipping up the A93 to Braemar. But Glasgow is, we can say, a better place to live in if you want to go Munro bagging more efficiently. And I thought that was quite an intriguing comparison between two rivals. Now, by this point, I think you're quite analytically fluent. So you're probably saying, where's the graph, John? Show us the graph. Well, here is the graph. So again, we can see how Glasgow, within 60 minutes drive, so 1 hour, you're instantly into Munro territory. The first, of course, there, that little hump is Ben Lomond. And then quickly you start to notch up more as you travel. Within 2 hours traveling, you've got over 60 Munros from Glasgow. That's the green line. Edinburgh, by contrast, you've got to drive for at least about 115 minutes before you can get anywhere. And then they do rise quite quickly. So you can see some kind of comparison. It's not game over here in Edinburgh, but Glasgow does have an edge. Now, that's all very well for two places that are cities. But again, remember your original question. It's where is the best place in Scotland? And by now, you're probably thinking, well, it's got to be somewhere a bit more central. So what I did here, I downloaded a data set from the Ordnance Survey of basically place names in Scotland. When I first ran it, there was something like 6,000, including loads of tiny little hamlets, which really didn't add anything, and which the analysis looked like it would take a year to complete. So I thinned it down to major towns and villages, which pretty much covers them all anyway. If it's red, it means it's a really long way to travel to get all your Munros. By contrast, if it's orange, it's okay. Yellow's not bad, but green is really where the money is. So any of these green dots are basically your better places to live. And if you want to see the best, then here are the results. It's tucked away in there, and we've got right next to each other, we've got Spearnbridge, we've got Inverroy and Roybridge. So what this total means, if you lived in Spearnbridge in your dream house, and you wanted to drive to all the car parks, and remember, some car parks you're going to have to visit twice, and I know it's not really real. I know that in real life, people would say, go to Skye for a week, or they go to Glencoe for a week, but work with me here, because this is the only way we can model it in a computer. Assuming that you always went on individual trips from your home, leaving Spearnbridge, you would not chuck 19,500 miles in your car to do them all, which would take you 400 hours of driving. And that's an average speed of just under 50 miles an hour, which even itself could be a little bit ambitious if it was, say, summer stuck behind a camper van, for example. But there's some fairly decent stretches of road around there. Likewise, it's not too much slower for Inverroy and Roybridge, whereas the worst place is clearly out of Hebrides, Lewis, up in even Orkney and Shetland. No logical person would elect to live there to go Munro bagging. But I kind of thought, I thought this would be an interesting question to answer. And I wonder how many of you, perhaps if you chose Spearnbridge or somewhere around that Fort William area, you could share your success with us in the chat. But yeah, next time in the pub, someone asks you where the best place for Munro bagging is, you can tell them with certainty that it is Spearnbridge. And to locate that on our original map, it is just here, which kind of makes good visual sense. So I suppose that is the answer to the question. And in answering that, it's been quite fun to visit lots of areas, lots of historical ideas. And I suppose I just want to congratulate the club again for doing them all in a day. For those of you who are working on your Munros, you have my absolute respect and support. And for those of you who aren't doing the Munros, then I think that's absolutely fine too. I am not a Carnethy member, but I have done the Skyline twice now, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly. I ran up my first Munro, which is Derry Cairngorm, last October. So I can definitely imagine a little bit more what it's like to run them. And I can certainly see that you could save a heck of a lot of time by planning an expedition. But I think you could save the most time by living in Spearnbridge. So thank you very much for coming along for the journey. And yeah, if you've got any questions, I'm here all night. Thank you.
Well, John, that's fantastic. What I love the music as well, but it's very amusing. I guess my question is probably you don't have an answer, but I'm wondering if you could just do a Corbet's version for us to work out what the optimum line around the Corbet's on the 28th of May is going to be, because that's that is technically, I think it's actually harder than the Munros to string them together, but I don't know whether you've done any analysis on that.
It would have been a nice to have. It would involve quite a lot of spreadsheet work, but then if Hugh Munro could do it, then I suppose so could we. Yeah, you would need a list of all the car park points. Now, the problem with the Corbet's is because they have this rule about the ascent and reascent, They're slightly harder to string together. It's probably easier to string together a lot of Munros because you don't have that stipulation of having to descend 500 feet. So I imagine it will be a bit logistically harder. The Corbetts generally have better views though, because they're a bit more isolated, but the paths aren't as good. And I suppose there'll be a bit more flexibility with parking. So you've got so many variables to play with. It's almost impossible to conceive of an optimal solution for one person, let alone 200. But yeah, if I get around to that, I'll let you know, because it could make for a fun tweet or something.
Well, I'll open up to other questions. There's been a few people saying thanks and what amazing talk and brilliant visuals. So, but does anyone have any questions for John? Open your mics and ask away. The deathly silence, goodness me.
Here's a question from James. Were the early Munros all wealthy gentlemen of leisure, or did they have jobs to limit them? So as far as I can ascertain, and I'm no historian, the early members were absolutely gentlemen, not necessarily of leisure. So Munro himself, okay, so he was a baronet. He wasn't knighted for his Munro list, to be clear. He inherited a baronetcy from his father, who in turn got that from Munro's uncle. So he was certainly a wealthy individual with land and considerable means to his name, but he also was very involved in managing the estates. And in fact, he died in France, where he was running almost like an aid station for the soldiers during the war. So he was quite benevolent. Some of his contemporaries, who were often landowners, but not exclusively Tories, I suppose they would have fitted the Victorian gentleman stereotype. It probably wasn't for a few years until the Hills became a bit more democratic, let alone with the ladies' mountaineering club. And I think these days, the Hills are a much more democratic place. But yes, in the early days, you can imagine quite well-to-do Victorian gents who maybe had to find some kind of scientific rationale to be there, whether that would be botany or geology, or perhaps aneroid barometers and cartography, almost to legitimize what they really wanted to do, which was just to be out in the hills. And let's not forget that going out in the hills was itself a kind of modern phenomenon. Writers of old often portrayed hills and wild places in quite disturbing, sinister, fear-ridden places. You didn't go to mountains for pleasure. You were afraid of mountains. People who would go on the grand tour to Europe would have to travel over the Alps, where it was considerable risk of weather or of even being held up or attacked. So mountains weren't seen as places of recreation, of, for us, letting our hair down or getting away from modern life. And I think if you lived there, if you were a shepherd who happened to have to climb up a Munro to keep watch over your flock, you weren't doing that to bag the hill. You were doing it because it's work. So it's interesting to note how our attitudes to landscapes and places has changed so radically.
Thanks, John. Just for I don't know if you've been able to see the chat, but I think probably the closest guess we got was Stephanie, who said Fort William, and closely behind was probably Lagan, which is just up the road from Speen Bridge sort of direction. So well done for those two. I've just have another thought that came to mind. You showed an early map that Munro must have used and commented that there are some spot heights, but at some, if anyone's ever been out navigating with me, I absolutely love contours. I think they're the most wonderful invention. I'm just wondering, historically, if you know, when was the jump between, like a flat map with, some spot heights to the introduction of contours? Because that's a massive step forward in map making. Did it require satellites, or did it happen before that?
So it's a good question. I did do a PhD some years ago where I did read a paper about this, and I since met someone who debunked it. So the old theory was that before contours, which is a land elevation line joining points of equal altitude, though actually it was much more useful for ships in the sea for bathymetry, because depth is quite essential, as James found out navigating his boat. So the first, they call them isolines, any line joining a point of equal value. The first were actually in the sea. They didn't come onto land until I think the late 18th century, but it's disputed where they first appeared. There was a French chap who's alleged to created them for land. Anyone who's been to Schiehallion in the car park there will have seen a very intriguing plaque about the Big G, the Big Gravity Experiment, with Neville Maskelyne, who was the Astronomer Royal, and Charles Hutton, who was sent the data to analyze. And they were basically trying to figure out the mass of the Earth by analyzing deflections in a pendulum, which is really, really sensitive work. So they set up some huts on Schiehallion. They spent many cold months where they needed star sightings to get their longitude and latitude really precisely. And they would take measurements on the top of the mountain and at the side. And by measuring the different deflections, they could try and figure out how much the mass of the Earth was. It sounds quite far-fetched, but they nailed it to really quite a precise level. In so doing, they notated all the heights of the places they were working at. And I think it was Hutton who, back in London, with all these reams of calculations, and it's mind-boggling how they even made maps based on trigonometry and numbers without computers, let alone Hutton trying to figure out what to do. And he actually started to connect them up with dotted lines, not to try and represent height, but simply as a way of helping the analysis. So some people would say, and if you go to Schiehallion, some would say that that's the birth of the contour line, which is maybe an interesting narrative. But I think it's probably like one of these ideas that developed in multiple different places at the same time. But contours are great, the way that they can describe the shape of almost any landscape. They're no good for overhangs. They just don't work. But for any kind of hill that doesn't have an inverted surface, the contour line is a game changer. And if you look at the history of cartography and the way that they use different lines and hachures and sometimes 3D profiles, the maps of Scotland are fantastic for that. But really, contours are quite a scientific advancement. So I'm not 100% sure what the actual answer is. I've probably spoken way more than you were expecting or even wanted, but it's a slightly disputed area, I believe.
Well, I don't know. I think they're a magnificent invention, and I didn't think about the bathymetry point, which is interesting. There's a question from Pete Buckley. He's not able to ask it. He says, John, in your analysis, did you look at the question such as a traveling salesman problem, as in what is the shortest distance to do all the Munros, and how far off was Donny Campbell? I don't know if you've ever looked at that, or whether maybe that's a known answer anyway, what the shortest distance to do all the Munros is.
So the traveling sales problem is a way to optimize a route between lots of different stops. And the more stops there are, the more it becomes kind of exponentially and fiendishly difficult to try and calculate an optimum. In this case, there were just so many variables. Donny's route, well, is obviously the record. And to be self-propelled, you either need a bicycle or a canoe or a kayak to get obviously across Mull, or sometimes over to, I think, to Skye. I've read about some ventures. So there are so many variables that I think it would be impossible to calculate using any kind of meaningful data, because people run and cycle and swim and paddle. It's an intriguing problem, but I think that the nature of our geography would render it too difficult to calculate. Whether Donny's record will be broken anytime soon, say sub 30 days, I suppose in some ways it's only a matter of time, but I don't expect that one to go anytime soon. But it's fascinating to see how the records have fallen. And I think many, if you read the accounts of the record breakers, they would spend months and months and months with all sorts of maps cut up and sellotaped and stuck on the floor, trying to figure out the optimum route. The nice thing is that they share their routes. And I think Donny spoke to you guys last year, is that right?
Yeah, he did, and unfortunately, because he has a business, he didn't want us to record it. But it was quite an astounding talk for all sorts of reasons. I mean, one thing that interested me is he did a lot of straight lining. He kind of thought, yeah, you could go around the hills, or you could contour them, or you can straight line it between them. And because he's such a beast a lot of the things he straight lined. So it didn't matter whether what the ascent or descent was. He just took the shortest distance in some cases. So I would invite you to read Keith Burns's suggestion on how he would go about finding the shortest, the best location for the summit. And I'll just for you, John, I'll put Keith in context. He was responsible for building nuclear power stations, so he's kind of he's got that background in science, which is an interesting little read if you've got time. Does anyone else have any other questions? Well, thank you very much. We'll call it quits there. I have two things to say. Well, three things. A reminder for the charity. A reminder that tomorrow is Tuesday. Everyone on this call, I hope you are aware of what that is. If you're not, we'll see you at 8:22 on the summit ridge between Cairketton and Alamure. We need about 2,000 people, so 50 of you would be good. And also the next talk will be on the 7th of March, a bit more in the Antarctic and some incredible flying stories from a search and rescue pilot. So thanks to John and thanks to James and thanks to everyone for listening in. I hope you've enjoyed tonight. If you did, tell your mates and hopefully see you next time.